Hey, it's Ryan from Red Panda Recording. I'm here with Joseph Branciforte. We are in his studio, Greyfade Studio in Brooklyn, New York. Joe, thanks for having us for Studio Hang.
Yeah, thanks for coming by, man.
So, my first question, you're a man who wears many hats. Drummer, pianist, multi-instrumentalist, composer. You do some programming, McDSP, obviously engineer, producer, studio owner, and most recently you started a record label. Congrats on that.
Thank you.
So how do you keep all of that balanced?
Oh man, well that's like an everyday battle and question. I mean, that's the question, I guess, in some regards that I am like trying to answer every day, but it's not one that I've definitively solved.
Okay.
In any way. It's just kind of like every week is totally different, and I keep trying to like adjust the balances until I get the right ratios of the things that I want to be working on in balance, but it's never quite there. It's always like sort of you're striving for the right balance and ratio of each thing. But I don't know. I've always felt naturally drawn to all of them, so it's hard for me to cut stuff out. You know what I mean? So,
And you're balancing your own work and your own projects that you're writing for, performing, recording, etc., and then you're balancing that with work for your clients.
Yeah.
So I guess really week to week it could be anything.
Yeah, there could be like this week, for instance, it's all client work. I'm not really working on too much of my own stuff other than just like shipping out records for the label. And then, but next week it's going to be more like intensive on like some of my own projects. So, and then there's weeks where it's balanced, where I'll be like working during the day on other people's stuff and then go home and composing and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, you know the deal. It's like just trying to, cram in all the things you want and while still staying afloat in the, in the city.
Do you find it's important? Do you consciously block out time on your schedule for your own sort of craft, your own?
Well, yeah, actually last year I did that very consciously, and I kind of stopped it this year, and I'm bummed that I did, but I was doing this thing that I actually picked up from a friend of mine, Taylor Dupree, who is also a mastering engineer and a musician, and he told me about this thing he was doing where he just blocked out every Thursday in his calendar for like a year and just said like on Thursday I'm just making sounds in the studio for myself and just experimenting. So I tried that last year, and I did every Wednesday, just one day. And it's a kind of freeing because you just put it in the calendar. You see like the entire year of 2018, every single Wednesday was blocked. So if a client says like, hey, what are you doing in like August, on like the 21st or something, I'm like, actually, I'm kind of busy that day.
Yeah.
So it's strange, but if I don't take that, this year I haven't done that, and it's become much more like my week is just always shifting. So I do feel like when I was younger, it was more about just saying yes to everything, and the schedule was just kind of always shifting.
Sure.
But as you get older, it's like you kind of start needing a little more sanity on your week-to-week schedule. So I've been consciously trying to make sessions on certain days of the week and block out other ones.
So you touched on an important idea there, and what is the importance of saying no sometimes to?
Well, I mean, like I said, like in my 20s, I don't remember saying no very often. I mean, I kind of was like finding, it wasn't like I was just saying yes to like all kinds of strange music. I was within a niche of music that I wanted to be working on. But within that, I kind of just said yes to everything because I felt like, I don't know, to me, it was always the contrast between, well, you could be like doing like a barista gig or something. So I'd rather be working on even music that I'm not really into. I still kind of hold that in me a little bit. Like nothing is below me. I never want to give off that thing like, oh, I'm not going to work on that. Because I do think that every project presents its own challenges that you can grow from. But I've become a little more firm with like specifically projects that, I don't know how to say this nicely, but just like kind of become more trouble than it's psychologically and mentally like draining more energy than I necessarily wanted to, and it's not like musically something that's being very rewarding. Those don't happen that often, but I'm much quicker to kind of cut that back. And I think that is just a thing where you start to realize like once you're making enough money where you're not starving, you need to just do that for yourself sometimes to stay centered and like enthusiastic about what you're doing. Like I don't want to become some bitter guy who's just bummed about coming into the studio. Like, it should be fun.
Sure.
So, I have a pretty high tolerance for that. You have to do something really extreme to get to that level, but I do feel like you got to set boundaries for yourself. Otherwise, there's that tendency where, hey man, can you do this thing? We're flying in and we can only work at like 2 a.m. to like 6 or something. Like, can you do that? Like, it would be awesome if you could. And it's just sort of like, no, I can't do that. I mean, because I have a session the next day, or that'll mess me up for the whole rest of the week or something. Mm-hmm. So you have to know what you can do, and the older you get, the more you just, I think, know when it's appropriate to just kind of say, draw the line.
Yeah. And you mentioned, sort of working in a specific niche within music. How, for people who aren't familiar with the music that you work with, how would you describe it?
I mean, creative, art music or something like that. I don't know. Like, I don't work. It's not by choice really, but I just haven't really worked as much in like the singer-songwriter or like song-based world. Mm-hmm. It's more like experimental, jazz, electronic music, avant rock kind of stuff, contemporary classical music, stuff like that. So tends to be more fringe music, but I don't know, again, like it's not, I listen to, it's not like that's the only stuff I like, but it just seems to be kind of like how things have worked out.
Right. Now, would you say, was that sort of a conscious choice, or that, as you're saying, the more you work in one direction, that's just sort of following where the work goes?
It definitely started more consciously. Like when I started out, I was trying to contact particularly artists that I wanted to work with, and I really began developing relationships like early in my 20s. I was doing mobile recordings. Mm-hmm. I don't remember. Is that maybe how we first met, or that could be wrong. I think it actually was, right?
I do believe you did a mobile recording for me once upon a time.
Yeah, or there's some group you were in or something like that.
Yeah.
So I kind of got out there doing that, and I tended to pick, in the beginning, I would try to reach out to people offering like a very low rate, or even just be like, hey, can I just come and record it just for the practice? Mm-hmm. And I would just seek out people that I was into, people like doing gigs at the Stone or something like that. Mm-hmm. Whatever kinds of stuff I was into at the time. And so that kind of led to a whole network of relationships. But but it's not fully conscious. Like when I get projects that are more like song-based or even like a rock record, I really enjoy working on it. And in some senses, like those type of projects on paper seem like less experimental, but they can be more open to like sonic ideas and layering and overdubbing and like creating a kind of sonic composition more so than the quote unquote like free jazz people who just kind of want you to set up some mics and like record the thing flat. So it's not always linear as far as like what interests me as an engineer versus what interests me musically. Like there's sometimes a weird Venn diagram of that happening.
And when you're working, I know every situation and every record or project's going to be different, but how do you know how far that you can sort of push creatively in your role as an engineer or mixing with some of the artists that you're working with?
That's tricky. I think it's like in any relationship, like personal relationship, you begin maybe more cautiously, and then you kind of like test where the boundaries are. Sometimes it's very appropriate to inject creative ideas, and sometimes I think it's really important to not say anything and let the creative energies of the project express themselves without your influence. So I think it's just a case-by-case thing, and you have to kind of feel it out. But I've often found like that when I put in less creative input, sometimes it like moves towards a result that might have been better than if I did. So I think, again, when I was younger, I might have been more eager to like, hey, we should try this thing. Mm-hmm. But you also don't want to become so vacant that you're not adding anything to the project. Sometimes it is cool to be excited about something and try something crazy and have it fail. So it's case by case. But like I said, like a lot of the music I work on, it's just, that's not always called for. They're not looking, a lot of jazz artists are not really looking for some crazy creative input. Mm-hmm. It's just sort of like, make it sound good, like make the drums sound like drums, pan the stuff, put it on a nice reverb, and like get good balances, and that's the record. So sometimes it can be very like simple, and I'm cool with that as much as I'm cool with doing something super creative and off the wall.
Yeah. And since a lot of the music that you're recording and you're mixing, I guess how would we describe it? Maybe it's more acoustic based or sort of the natural sounds of the instruments.
Mm.
How have you had to change your workflow or your processes with more and more how we're pushing into digital? And we'll get into the. I know you're just pressed a bunch of vinyl for your first release. We'll get into that, but how has the sort of digital push changed the way you work?
You mean digital releases, or
Yeah,
or the
sort of.
digital like workflow in the studio?
More that the end medium is shifted to digital.
I see. Well, I mean, it hasn't. I wouldn't say that necessarily has affected anything. I mean, because that shift has been happening basically the whole time that has been in place the whole time I've been in the game. I would say, like, I started maybe mixing my first records proper maybe in like the early 2010s.
Okay.
So I'm only like 10 years in, well, maybe a little earlier, 2008 or something like that. But like, so I'm like 10 years into it. I feel like the whole time it's been fairly flat as far as iTunes has been a thing. Maybe Bandcamp is now more of a thing, and streaming is obviously eclipsing both of those by far now. But I mean, I just kind of find it a drag actually, like and we could talk about this with my label. I'm not putting the releases on streaming. And a lot of the reason is just sonic. I just don't like the way I don't really like the way most of the streaming services sound. I think they just sound terrible. Yeah. And it's hard to hear mixes that you put a lot of effort into, like played back over those. So anyway, that's a side topic, but yeah. I don't necessarily think that it's changed my approach. I'll always check mixes on different, systems that I think people will listen on, like iPod earbuds, or I'll even check stuff on my iPhone once in a while just to see like, oh, how is this translating? If you're just listening to a Bandcamp clip, browsing on your iPhone, are you losing information? So I'm trying to be conscious of that, but mostly I'm just listening to these speakers, and if it sounds good here, I'm kind of happy with it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, let's dig into that. I think, the streaming, the whole streaming concept, I think, is the big boogeyman in the room right now for, I think, everybody in music. And everybody has a lot of sort of what I call hot take opinions on it. So talk a little bit more about that as a conscious decision, starting this label and your first release now, and you have another release coming out soon?
Yeah, by the end of the year.
Okay. So you're avoiding streaming, and this is for artistic, like you want this to be heard in the way that you intended. Is that?
That's the most important caveat, yeah. I mean, it's been talked to death, the financial aspects of the streaming services and how it is just not equitable or sustainable for artists. I mean, I think that's well documented. I don't have anything to add to that. I agree with most of the analysis there. But I think the thing that I'm more concerned about is just like this private experience that I think listeners had with artists back in the day. And, that also has been kind of talked to death as well. But, I think part of what people respond to with the whole vinyl record resurgence is kind of this idea that you're not on the internet, you're not being advertised at, you're kind of just placing this physical object on your turntable and you're alone with sound for, half hour or whatever. And I think that in the digital paradigm that there should be some analogous concept to that. And for me, the streaming thing, it's just not leading towards an outcome that I think is really conducive to deep listening or like trying to establish relationships among artists and listeners as equals and stuff like that. I think that, there's many better ways in the digital economy to make those relationships work that don't involve like this middleman that's kind of mediating between those two forces in a what I would consider kind of like dishonest way, or at very least just not helpful way. So I just felt like it wasn't that I was starting the label in order to have it be an anti-streaming campaign, but when I thought about, okay, I'm going to spend all this time really making these records as good as I can possibly make them, when I thought about the prospect of putting them on Spotify or whatever, it just seemed like a no-brainer to not do it, because it just, like I said, it's hard for me as an engineer to listen to that stuff back. It's just like kind of heartbreaking to hear all the work you've done and just hear it flattened out with just all this horrible compression and artifacts. And like when you really listen, it's funny because it's like my girlfriend, for instance, she's not a musician or an engineer or anything. She can't really tell the difference, or thinks she can't tell the difference between Spotify or a high res or whatever. To her, it's just like, yeah, whatever. But when I brought her in here and I play her on the Barefoots, I'm like, here's the track, here's the track on Spotify. It's like, what? She's like, even like someone who's uneducated completely can just immediately hear it. It's not subtle. So I don't know what to say other than just for me, it was just kind of an obvious decision. But I get that, for other artists who are trying to like tap into a certain market and whatever, maybe that's a viable option. But I also think that we've been sold this like false bill of goods about exposure, quote unquote, and that we need these services in order to give us exposure. I think there's tons of ways to get exposure, and often in more experimental niche music, I think there's like more credibility in like just doing it without these services. I think in a weird way, it just like, to me as a consumer of music, it lends credibility to the operation to say like, we're going to eschew these kind of services that philosophically don't jive with what we want to do,